I'd driven from my home in France to England to collect my boat on the 3rd of March. I'd done some filming for the BBC and so on, and the whole pandemic thing was only just beginning to evolve. By the time I arrived here in Brighton, which was around the 19th of March, it had all become serious. People were panic buying in the supermarkets, social distancing was being requested, if not being totally enforced, and the whole thing had escalated out of my control. I ended up with a situation where my motor car was in Lymington, and it's a Spanish car. Its insurance for being in England would run out in a few weeks' time. My boat, Golden Haze, was not in her berth, which is Boulogne-sur-Mer in France. Sailing Gently, episode 2, getting Golden Haze home to France during a pandemic. Then I wandered up to the boatyard area of Brighton Marina, up at the top, to a company called Eurotech, where I went in to inquire about getting my electronics repaired. I needed the wind instruments, I needed the autopilot, most of all, and the speed log fixing, none of which were demonstrated. I didn't know what was wrong with them. I didn't know if I'd broken them, bashing around in the cylinder with the film crew on board, or whether it was electronics fault or what it was. And I thought I might have broken them, but there we go. So I spoke to the nice lady there and said, look, I'm going to take the boat. I don't want to get stuck here because I want to keep making progress, and theoretically from Eastbourne I can do a one-hit 45-mile trip from Eastbourne to Boulogne. So if I take the boat round to Eastbourne day after tomorrow, when the weather looks suitable, would it be possible for the people in Eastbourne to fix the boat? Malcolm called from the back office, we'll book you in for next Thursday in Eastbourne. And I went, oh, thank you very much, sounds wonderful. So went back to the boat, had one more day of warmth, and on the Wednesday set sail out of Brighton round to Eastbourne, a mere just 20 miles. I left, I don't know, I'd woken up at 7 o'clock in the morning and it was daylight, and I could have left it till later, but according to my chart, the channel into Eastbourne holds a depth of 2 meters, the dredge channel is 2 meters, and that's chart datum, so if anything that's not spring tides, there's going to be more water than that, and it's buoyed, and there's a sort of basin area, which I remember from sailing in there once about 25 years ago, there's a sort of area where they used to keep the lifeboat, sort of in front of the 2 locks, because you lock into Eastbourne, there's a locking system. So, probably a bad decision. I left about 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning. Bit of a challenge because I was being blown onto the visitor's pontoon. Bit of a challenge getting off the pontoon, but did that all right. And then only had to put away the fenders and lines before I proceeded out through Brighton Channel, which was pretty shallow again, and I made course for Beachy Head, which is, I don't know, 10, 12, 50 miles or something from Brighton. Went round Beachy Head and then found my way into Eastbourne approaches. Hard to find. I actually found it very difficult to identify the entrance. It's actually on the headland. When you come round Beachy Head, you pass a pier which looks like it could be an entrance to a marina, but it's not. There are a couple of large boats, large rowboats tied up there. Got to, looked further on, and there was a sort of headland, but no markings on it, so I headed for that. Yes, I had a chart plotter. The trouble is, the damn thing with the touchscreen doesn't work with gloves on. The touchscreen doesn't work with cold fingers. It's a hybrid. There's a control knob, but the control knob is so insensitive. You can't work it with gloves. I mean, just so anyway. I just went back to the old. For goodness' sake, I'm going down the coast. It's not a mega challenge, and there's 7 or 8 meters of water underneath. So I headed for this headland, and when I got to the headland, I discovered this headland does in fact mark the entrance to Sovereign Harbour, Eastbourne, dredged channel. There's a red marker buoy out there to the north of the marker buoy. There is clearly shallow water, and there's a load of little green buoys marking it. But on the port hand side of the channel, there's this largish buoy, and I was able to go around that and gingerly feel my way up the channel at 0 knots. Well, 2.5 of a knot or something. I mean, really, really slowly. Going up that channel, there's no more chart datum of 2 meters than fly. I mean, this was half tide. This was 3 hours after low water, and the depth sounder was showing probably only a meter or so under my keel. So that meant it was 2.5 meters. It was, and if I went anywhere not in the middle of the dredged channel, the echo sounder was going down dramatically. I tried calling them on channel 80, and that failed totally. Eastbourne doesn't operate on channel 80 like all the ones did at Gosport and all the ones and Brighton Marina did. It seems to operate on channel 17, if I remember correctly. It is marked up just outside the locks. So got to outside the locks, called them up on channel 17, and they instructed me to come into the lock and tie up, but that I was not to approach the office, I was not to go ashore because they were operating total lockdown. So in the 3 days between my arriving at Brighton Marina, run by Premier, where they weren't operating a total lockdown, to arriving in Eastbourne, Premier Marinas, I'm sure quite rightly, had gone into total lockdown, and staff and customers, marineros like me, were not allowed to make close contact with the staff. So anyway, so I tied up to the floating pontoon, floated up to the top. Very nice guy came down onto the pontoon and said, okay, we're going to put you into a visitor's berth. When you come out of the lock gates, just hang a left, and you can either go port side 2 or starboard side 2, whichever you prefer. It's you can park either side of that berth. And he showed me on a plan on the wall where the berth was. Lock gates opened, untied her, flashed up the engine again, drove out of the gate, hung a left, and made my way into the visitor's berth. Having tied up and made fast, I came out of the marina, walked across the 2 bridges, through the 2 bridges that go across the top of the lock gates, to the marina office, where I stood outside at the top of the stairs, and through a window they handed me the welcome pack with my electricity card in it and the details of Wi-Fi and all the rest of it. I went back to the boat, plugged in, and got warm again, and had a meal. Next morning, Eurotech arrived, led by Malcolm, who knows more about boat electronics than anyone I have ever met in my life. Absolutely brilliantly knowledgeable. He went through all my gear. He got the autopilot working, he got the wind instruments working, he got the log working. His young assistant, who's obviously a very talented young sailor, went up the mast to check out that the wind instruments was nothing wrong with my wind vane, nothing wrong with all that gear. All the problem were electronics in the pod, which is in front of the steering wheel. First rate, absolutely first rate. And they finished up about 2 o'clock, 2:30, something like that. and headed back to Brighton. The weather was then appalling for 4 or 5 days. And I looked at my plan. The wind had gone round to the east and decided that to get to Boulogne directly from Eastbourne, which is, to be fair, only about 45 miles across the shipping lanes, was just not a go with the wind hard on the nose. I could motor, but I bet I would only make about 3 knots. And in that cold, I really didn't fancy being out in the channel, in the dark, in the freezing cold, not knowing what sort of reception I was going to get in Boulogne. So with the lockdown now proceeding at a pace, but people not restricted in travelling, I decided that the best thing to do was to get my car back to France. So my darling nephew Sim drove down in his car from London, picked me up and drove me to Lymington, where I picked up my car and from Lymington drove to Folkestone for the Channel Tunnel, bought a Channel Tunnel ferry ticket at double the price advertised, because the closer you get to booking with the Channel Tunnel, the higher the prices go. So they just raise and raise and raise the price, which seems a bit unfair, especially considering that only 6 or 8 cars were on that Channel Tunnel train that I took. I got to French immigration in Folkestone, and the French immigration people accepted the fact that my home was in Boulogne, so they permitted me to go, and I drove onto the tunnel train, got off in Calais and drove to my home here in Boulogne. Spent the next day here in Boulogne checking out how to get to Calais, which was impossible by any form of transport, public transport. I called a taxi, and the guy was pleased with the job. I charged him €100 for it, but he was pleased to have the job, and we practiced the French 1 meter distancing by I sat in the back seat first away from him, and I just had my little bag with some clean knickers and things in it. Got to Calais, got on a P&O ferry at Calais, and they charge the normal price that they advertise all the time. P&O are a wonderful company, first rate. I was the only foot passenger, and there were only 6 or 7 motor cars on that ferry, but loads of lorries, dozens and dozens and dozens of lorries. Shunted across the channel, having had a great fry-up breakfast, got on a train at Dover for Eastbourne, and from Eastbourne got back to Golden Haze and got on board, only to discover that there were 3 more days of gales forecast. And when the gales went through, according to Weather Online, it was still going to be easterlies. And I went, yep, I'm not going to do this. I'm too old, I'm too tired, and it's too cold, and it's going to take too long. So I resolved to change my plan and go from Eastbourne to Dover. And from Dover, it would then only be a 20-mile hit across the channel to get to Boulogne. So I made a passage plan and put it into the plotter. I now had wind instruments, I now had an autopilot, I now had a speed log, and I had a windlass that worked in case anything went horribly wrong. Sat there for 3 days, and at the end of 3 days the winds eased. They were still coming from the east, southeast, and I decided to leave at crack of dawn to make this 40-odd mile, 42-odd mile hit from Eastbourne round Dungeness, where I'd been filming for the Doctor Who only a couple of weeks before, and into Dover. It felt like a long way, and according to my tidal atlas, I would be pushing the tide almost all the way, which would slow me up. I reckon I was going to have up to a knot and a half of tide against me for an awful lot of the journey. So I wanted to leave early, so I got some of the flood tide going up towards Dungeness, and then the ebb tide would be against me from Dungeness to Dover, but that's only 20 miles. And I felt if I kept inshore, I might be able to miss the worst of it. Got into the lock at 6:30, 7 o'clock, there was one fishing boat already in there. Three. He asked me what I drew, and I said 1 meter 50, and he went, "Well, be careful when you're coming out." And I went, "Oh, thank you very much. I'll take note of that." The gates opened. He left in a roar of twin engines, and I proceeded to untie, which took me a few minutes. It was then had the slight problem of getting off again with the wind pushing me on from the pontoon, and I just got out into the basin area in front of the two locks when my handheld VHF sprang into life, and I heard the fishing boat say to the marina, "Tell the old bloke in Golden Haze there's no water on the bar and he's not going to make it across at 1 meter 50 draft." And I went, "Ow, knickers." So I put my fenders back on and put Golden Haze into a stern and gingerly motored backwards back into the lock and tied up alongside into the lock. The guys at Brighton Marina said, "Well, we can lock you out and you can tie up and then try again in a couple of hours." And I went, "Oh, do us a favour. I'm by myself and all this tying up and untying is really rich. Can I just sit in the lock?" And they went, "Yes, of course," which was very generous of them. So to cut a long story short, I sat in the lock for a couple of hours. They did 2 or 3 lockings with the few other fishing boats that were going in and out. And at just after 8, they said, "We reckon you can leave on this next lock. You should get out if you stay in the mid-channel." So I thanked them and I gingerly motored out and kept in the middle of the channel, and it was shallow. It really was shallow. I think there may have been only sort of like 6 inches under the keel at some point. Past the buoy, keeping clear of the green buoys to port, because there's a lot of shallow water that side. You can actually see it breaking. You can see the waves breaking on the sandbank there, and got her out into the channel, which was lumpy. This easterly wind had made it really lumpy out there. But I had the autopilot, which worked for the first time. Thanks, Malcolm. And stuck the autopilot on and gingerly started plodding around the deck, crawling around the deck, getting in my fenders and lines and warps and everything else, and setting sail for Dungeness, which was probably 20 odd miles from Eastbourne harbour entrance. Got her going on the autopilot. What a relief not to have to stand behind the wheel and helm every inch of the way. So I plodded, making quite good speed over the ground. I was surprised. I was carrying the tide. It had been worth it. I was carrying the tide. We were doing 6 knots over the ground. As I was approaching Dungeness, really congratulating myself for doing so well, I got a call on channel 16 on my VHF handheld saying, "Golden Haze, this is the military firing zone." So naturally I responded, and they said, "Well, are you aware that you are in a military firing zone and you need to clear the area immediately?" So I went, "Yes, no, I wasn't aware," and I confess I wasn't aware. I hadn't looked at the chart. I mean, part of the trouble with electronic charts is I hadn't actually zoomed in from the course from Eastbourne to Dungeness, and what I'd not done was actually looked at it in close detail, and I certainly hadn't looked at it in close detail around the headland of Dungeness. I'd just set a waypoint that cleared the shallows and seemed reasonable. They said, "Please steer," I think it was 135 degrees, until you are parallel with the power station, at which point you can resume your course. To which I said, yes, I will, thank you." So I turned right 135 into an easterly wind. I mean, I went from trotting along with the current at 5 to 6 knots to 2 to 3 knots over the ground. Had to pull the Jenny in because it was just flapping, going direct to windward like that, and I was just down on the motor. pushing me along, as I say, at 3 to 4 knots. I spent the time looking at the navigator and checking that this pecked line almost certainly was the firing engine, and so far, fair enough. I mean, my mistake, I've made an error. So for about half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, I plodded along until I saw that the plotter showed me being clear of the firing zone, and I was more or less a beam of the power station, at which point I put the plotter onto Dover Harbour Western Entrance, laid off a course and proceeded to head down that route, back up again at 5 to 6 knots. Interestingly, the tide was still in my favour. The tide was still running in my favour, only by half a knot or so, but I was surprised. I don't have a tidal atlas that examines that area totally, but clearly there are inshore eddies. So I had about 20 miles to go, I suppose, 4 hours, 3.5 hours, 3 hours maybe, to Dover Western Entrance, where my pilot book told me that when I was 2 miles off the entrance, I needed to call up Dover Port Control and ask permission to enter the harbour. So I made a little waypoint on the route. I made a little dot on the route, ready to do that. But 3 miles before, Dover Port Control came up on Channel 17 and said, "Golden Haze, are we to assume that you're going to pay us a visit?" Absolutely, I mean, charmingly, very nicely. And I went, "Dover Port Control, yes, absolutely. If I may, I would like to come into your marina." And they said, "Yes, of course, no problem. When you're 200 meters from the western entrance, give us another call and we'll clear and give you we'll give you clearance and permission to enter the harbour if all else is correct." I went, "Great, thank you very much." I proceeded to spend the next 3/4 of an hour getting the boat ready to come into Dover Harbour, because I had never been in the marina, never been there in my life before, no idea what to expect. So I called up Dover Port Control, and they gave me permission to enter. So I got in there. There was a fuel dock there, and so I fueled up at the dock. In the meantime, calling Marina, explained that I wanted to be there for 2 or 3 days because there was more bad weather coming in, and they said, and then I was going to leave for Boulogne, and they said, "Yeah, fine, so you can stay in the outer tidal harbour, we'll put you on a pontoon there, you're not to come to the office, you're not to do everything, call us on your telephone once you're parked up, and we'll give you the codes and all the rest of it by email and by telephone. But we are zero contact in this marina." That was absolutely fine. It was really easy for me to make my way up the pontoons in Golden Haze and put her alongside and park her up beside in the pontoon, which I did. And I spent the next 3 days riding out gales there, gales from the east, blowing like stink it was, and bitterly cold. And so, past 3 days in Dover. The tidal streams run such that going out of Dover Harbour, that if I steer at right angles across the shipping lanes, which is what I'm required to do, in fact, the tidal stream is going to push me down towards Boulogne the whole time. So it won't be 25 miles at all, it will be more like 21, 22, something like that. So that is 4 hours, 5 hours travelling. And if I get to Boulogne and they refuse me admission and they kick me out of the port or refuse to let me enter the port, then I can just turn around and go back to Dover, and I can be back at Dover by sunset, or an hour or so after darkness, whatever. I would be bucking the tide then, but that seemed fine. So I awoke at dawn, as I came off my mooring, I called up Dover Port Control, and they gave me permission to just exit the western entrance. They just said, go ahead, exit the western entrance, which was fine. I would at this point just like to say something about AIS. All these people, like the gunnery firing range at Dungeness, Dover Port Control watching my progress, and then later on Dover Coast Guard talking to me, they were all able to identify me because I've got an AIS transmitter built into my plotter. And having a transmitter means that the name of my boat is transmitted, its call sign, which nobody ever seems to use, and my course and speed and all those sorts of details are there for anybody who's got an AIS receiver. So, as well as its function of enabling me to not bump into ships, or ships not to bump into me, it is also an identifier for various authorities, and just on that basis alone, well worth having, I think. I laid off a course of 135 degrees, which if you look at a chart between Dover and Cap Grinet, that takes you straight across the shipping lanes at right angles, which is a requirement. If you're going to cross shipping lanes, you're required to cross them at right angles. So I kept that heading for the whole of the passage, knowing, because I'd looked at my tidal atlas, that the tidal stream was in fact going to push me southwest the whole time. I also knew that there is a very shallow area in the middle of the English Channel, and it's marked by a lightship and buoys, and is the shipping lanes stay a long, long way from it. I knew I would be pushed over that, but chart datum there was 3 meters 50, 4 meters, 5 meters, 6 meters. So, and as the weather was pretty calm, there was a bit of chop. There was the normal channel chop and some cold wind, but other than that, there was no chance of my grounding or going aground with Golden Haze, and I knew I'd be going over those banks. So off I set, and within 3/4 of an hour, I was entering the west-going shipping lanes, which is all the ships coming down from the North Sea out of probably Rotterdam and the German ports, coming down the North Sea, and then they come down past Dover, and they come down that side of the shipping lane. And that was not too bad. It was pretty empty. I had the AIS images on the chart plotter going. I didn't bother with the radar because the visibility was excellent. I could see France, I could see the White Cliffs of Dover behind me. Didn't see it, but what was important was that the AIS positions for all these ships were superimposed on my magnetic chart, on the chart plotter on the navigator. And I was able to get across the English side shipping lane pretty easily with no real problem whatsoever. And I was really pleased with myself, and I was well aware that I was being pushed. I was being pushed westwards by the tide, so I was going to end up nowhere near Cap Grinet. As I got into the shallow area near the Barn Lightship, near the shallow areas, my handheld sprung to life, and there was Dover Coast Guard calling me, asking me if I was aware that I was getting into shallow waters, and I was able to come back to them and thank them very much and say, yes, I was aware, and I didn't consider it to be a problem with my craft. They said, fine, okay, and they went away. But 20 minutes later, as I was entering French waters, Dover Coast Guard came back and told me the French Coast Guard at Cap Grinet wanted to speak to me on VHF, I think it was 77, and would I go onto that frequency and speak with them. So that's what I did. And this was when I confess my little heart sank, because it was a bit of a problem, because the eastbound shipping lane, the ships heading up the English Channel from the Atlantic towards Rotterdam and places, was very, very busy indeed, and I was having major problems with my with identifying which ship was which, because my gloves, the touch screen wouldn't work with my gloves on. When I took my gloves off, my fingers were too frozen to make the touch screen work, and the little knob on the hybrid knob was so difficult to operate. I couldn't accurately put it on things, so I was having a big problem identifying the names, which is what I needed to do in order to call them, of the various ships that I had to weave between, either go over across their bows or go across their stern. I mean, mainly across their stern, of course. So anyway, Cap Grenade Coast Guard spoke to me, and they asked me my intention, and I said, I'm going into Boulogne port. My intention is to go to Boulogne. My home is in Boulogne, and the port d'attache, the marina place for the boat, is in Bassin Napoleon in Boulogne Marina. And they then asked me for my address, they asked me for my passport number, they asked me when I had moved into my home in Boulogne, which was last September. They interrogated me for about 10 or 15 minutes. I had to drop the microphone a couple of times and whip up on deck and check I wasn't going to have a problem with the ships in the lane, because I'm crossing the lane, so I've got to keep out of their way. And also they were coming up on my starboard side, which means doubly I have to keep out of their way. So then at the end of the interview, it wasn't an interrogation, it was a very pleasant, very charming interview. They said, okay, we will, very well, we'll come back to you, stand by. So I said, stand by on this frequency or on 16? They said, stand by on 16. So fine, thank you very much. Put the microphone down, went back on deck into the cockpit, and proceeded to talk to, on the VHF, to various ships to agree that I would go around their stern, or they were going to accelerate slightly so to make it easier for me. They were very helpful, very friendly. AIS, I reckon, is absolutely brilliant. So I then spent the next hour and a half feeling concerned about the situation, naturally. Looking behind me, the White Cliffs of Dover were getting very, very small on the horizon, and the coast of France was getting very, very big on the horizon, and every minute that went by probably represented 2 minutes if I had to get back to Dover, because I would be going across, having to go into the stream, into the tidal stream, which had been favouring me on my passage to Boulogne. Hour and a half later, Cap Grenade came back on the, I had it on the handheld, put the handheld down, went down below, picked up the proper VHF microphone, and said, yep, this is Golden Haze, I copy, go ahead please sir. And they said, right, permission is granted for you to enter Boulogne. I mean, my little heart went, oh, thank goodness, thank goodness. You will proceed to the ship's berth. What is the berth number, please? And I gave them the berth number. An immigration official will come into the marina, will come to the pontoon, and will instruct you on how you ought to behave in relation to coronavirus here in France, and you will return from the boat to your apartment, where you will be in lockdown for 15 days. And I went, wonderful, thank you very much, I'm most grateful. And I said, well, what happens when I get to Boulogne port? Will they know I'm coming? They said, yes, we will contact Boulogne, and we will, they're aware of your arrival, they'll be aware of your arrival, and you'll be allowed to enter the port. All French ports are in fact closed to foreign flag vessels, but because it's your home and because it's the boat's port d'attache, you will be allowed in. Perfect. Absolutely true. So I went back on deck, and literally within half an hour, there was the big breakwater of the outer port of Boulogne. I called up Boulogne Port Control and said, this is Golden Haze, and I'm entering your harbour. and they went, yes, Golden Haze, we're aware of your arrival, come on in. And motored into the Bassin Napoleon for the first time in my life, and proceeded to jump ashore and tie the boat up and adjust the fenders. Whilst I was doing that, a very smartly dressed and charming immigration official, uniformed immigration official, arrived on the pontoon with a piece of paper in his hand and said, bienvenue, welcome. He told me about the lockdown procedures, that I had to have a paper, and he gave me a paper allowing me to return to my flat. That was getting Golden Haze home. That was getting her back to France, to her home, where I am now, in lockdown, only allowed out carrying an attestation and obeying all the rules. If you've enjoyed this video, please press the subscribe button. If you want to know when I'm going to release the next episode, ring the bell, press the bell button, and then you'll get a notification. I hope you've enjoyed it a bit. Fair winds and safe landfalls.